Every single time I drive past a Kingdom Hall, my chest tightens like someone's squeezing my heart with both hands. 63 years old, and I still feel that sick twist in my stomach when I see those plain buildings with their neat lawns and the discreet signs. $287,000. That's not a typo. That's the actual amount I donated over 34 years of my life to an organization that discarded me like yesterday's Watchtower magazine the moment I started asking questions they didn't want to answer. I'm not talking about pocket change dropped into contribution boxes on Sunday mornings. I'm talking about inheritance money, life insurance payouts, the sale of my mother's house, monthly automatic transfers that kept going even when I couldn't afford to fix my leaking roof. I'm talking about the kind of money that could have secured my retirement, paid for my grandchildren's education, or at least bought me a decent car instead of this 15-year-old sedan that breaks down every other month. The worst part isn't even the money itself. It's what I sacrificed to give it. The overtime shifts I worked at the hospital, coming home with my feet so swollen I could barely walk, just so I could increase my monthly donation. The vacations I never took. The dental work I postponed for years because the elders said the end was so close and Jehovah's organization needed the funds more urgently than I needed new crowns for my deteriorating molars. I gave that money believing I was storing up treasures in heaven, believing that every dollar I donated was bringing me closer to salvation and helping spread the truth to people who desperately needed to hear it. I believed the circuit overseers when they said that generous giving was a sign of strong faith. And I believed the elders when they assured us the money was being used to build new kingdom halls and support the worldwide preaching work. Now I know better. Now I know exactly where that money went. And it wasn't where they told me it was going. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This story doesn't start with the realization that I'd been deceived. It starts 34 years ago in Perth, Australia, when a friendly woman knocked on my door and asked if I'd ever wondered why there was so much suffering in the world. My name is Beverly Walsh, and I need to tell you this story before I lose my nerve or before the weight of it crushes what's left of my spirit. I'm sitting in my small apartment in Perth, staring at a spreadsheet I've spent the last 6 months reconstructing from old bank statements, donation receipts, and memory. The numbers don't lie, even when you wish they would. $287,000. That's in US dollars, and when I first calculated it in Australian dollars and then converted it, I had to sit down because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore. Before I dive into the deep end of this story, I want to ask you something. If you're watching this, please hit that subscribe button. Not for me, but because stories like mine need to be heard, and YouTube has a funny way of hiding videos that make certain organizations uncomfortable. Click the like button if you think people deserve to know the truth about where their donations actually go. And please leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I need to know I'm not alone in this. I need to know there are other people out there who understand what it feels like to wake up one day and realize you've been living in a carefully constructed illusion. This isn't a story about hatred or revenge. I don't hate Jehovah's Witnesses as people. Some of my closest friends for over 3 decades were witnesses, good people who genuinely believe they're doing the right thing. This is about an organization that operates like a corporation while claiming to be God's sole channel of communication on earth. This is about a system that extracts money from people who can barely afford it, all while telling them they're investing in their eternal future. I was 29 years old when I first encountered the witnesses. I'd just gone through a devastating divorce. My ex-husband had emptied our joint bank account and disappeared to New Zealand with a woman he'd been seeing for 2 years. And I was left raising our 5-year-old son alone on a nurse's salary. I was vulnerable, lonely, and desperately searching for answers about why my life had fallen apart. That's exactly when they find you. That's when they're most effective. The woman who knocked on my door was named June, and she seemed like the kindest person I'd ever met. She listened to me cry about my failed marriage. She brought me home-baked cookies. She offered to watch my son so I could pick up extra shifts at the hospital. She never pushed, never pressured, just gently suggested that maybe the Bible had some answers that could help me make sense of my pain. Within 6 months, I was attending meetings at the Kingdom Hall. Within a year I was baptized. Within 2 years, I was auxiliary pioneering and donating 10% of my gross income every single month. I need you to understand something crucial before we go any further. When you're inside, it doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like family. Feels like purpose. It feels like you've finally found the truth in a world full of lies. That's what makes it so dangerous. And that's why I gave so much for so long without ever questioning whether I should. The first donation I ever made was $20, and I remember feeling a surge of joy as I slipped it into the contribution box at the back of the Kingdom Hall after my first meeting. June had explained to me that, unlike other churches, witnesses didn't pass around collection plates or pressure anyone to give. Everything was voluntary, she said, guided by your own conscience and your personal relationship with Jehovah. That sounded so much better than the guilt-inducing sermons I remembered from the Catholic Church my mother had dragged me to as a child, where the priest seemed to spend half his time talking about tithing and the other half talking about hellfire. What June didn't tell me, what nobody told me in those early days, was how the voluntary giving would gradually be shaped and molded by constant reminders about the organization's financial needs. Started subtly. There would be local needs talks about how the Kingdom Hall needed a new roof, or how the circuit assembly expenses had exceeded the budgeted amount. The elders would mention during announcements that the worldwide work needed our support now more than ever. Articles in the Watchtower would discuss the importance of generous giving, citing examples of faithful servants who had donated their entire estates to the organization. Within my first year, my $20 donations had become weekly commitments of $50, which was a significant amount for a single mother working as a registered nurse in the early 90s. I was making around $40,000 a year, and I was giving away roughly $260 every month. That didn't include the special contributions for the circuit overseer's visit, the district convention expenses, the donations I made when I picked up literature from the counter, or the money I gave toward the Kingdom Hall remodel fund. My son Nathan was 6 years old and asking why we couldn't go to the movies like his school friends did, why we couldn't have pizza delivered on Friday nights, why he couldn't get new sneakers when his old ones were falling apart. I told him we were storing up treasures in heaven, that Jehovah would bless us for putting kingdom interests first. I believed that with every fiber of my being. I genuinely thought I was teaching my son valuable lessons about sacrifice and faith, about how material possessions meant nothing compared to spiritual riches. The congregation praised my generosity. The elders would occasionally pull me aside after meetings to tell me how much they appreciated my faithful support of the kingdom work. June would smile at me with such warmth and approval whenever I mentioned increasing my donations. I was getting the validation and recognition I'd been craving since my divorce, and it felt wonderful. I was somebody. Mattered. My contributions were making a difference in Jehovah's organization. Looking back now, I can see how they were grooming me, preparing me to become one of their most reliable financial supporters. They identified me early as someone who was emotionally vulnerable, financially stable enough to give regularly, and eager to please. They watched how I responded to praise, how I lit up when they acknowledged my donations, how I tried harder and gave more whenever they expressed approval. It was behavioral conditioning disguised as spiritual encouragement. By the end of my second year, I donated roughly $6,000. That might not sound like much compared to the final total, but for a single mother in suburban Perth, it was a fortune. That was money that could have gone into a college fund for Nathan, or a down payment on a small house, or simply building up an emergency savings account. Instead, it went into a contribution box, and from there into accounts I knew nothing about, managed by men I'd never meet, for purposes that were never clearly explained beyond vague references to the worldwide preaching work. The Kingdom Hall itself wasn't particularly impressive. It was a simple building that probably cost a fraction to maintain compared to what they were collecting from the congregation every month. I started to notice that the brothers who handled the accounts never provided detailed financial reports. We'd get brief announcements about the monthly expenses and income, but nothing itemized, nothing that explained where the surplus money went. When I asked June about it once, she looked uncomfortable and told me that we shouldn't question how Jehovah's organization managed its finances, that the faithful and discreet slave knew better than we did how the money should be used. That should have been my first warning sign. In any legitimate non-profit organization, financial transparency is considered essential. Donors have a right to know how their contributions are being used. But in the organization, asking questions about money was treated as a sign of weak faith or worse, as spiritual rebellion. so I stopped asking. I kept giving month after month, year after year, trusting that the men at the top were using my donations wisely and honestly. The meetings reinforced this trust constantly. We studied articles that painted the organization as the only true channel between God and humanity. We learned that questioning the governing body was equivalent to questioning Jehovah himself. We were taught that apostates, people who left the organization or criticized it, were mentally diseased and controlled by Satan. This created an environment where critical thinking was not just discouraged but actively portrayed as dangerous to your spiritual health and your chances of surviving Armageddon. By my 5th year in the organization, I'd been appointed as a regular pioneer, which meant I was committing to spend 70 hours a month in the door-to-door preaching work. This was on top of my full-time job at the hospital, raising Nathan, who was now 10 years old, and attending all the meetings and assemblies. I was exhausted constantly, running on coffee and the belief that Jehovah would give me the strength I needed to keep going. The elders praised my theocratic schedule, holding me up as an example to other sisters in the congregation about what real dedication looked like. The financial pressure increased proportionally with my increased responsibilities. As a pioneer, I was expected to set an example not just in preaching hours but in every aspect of my life, including financial generosity. There were talks specifically directed at pioneers about how we should simplify our lives, reduce our secular work, and focus more on spiritual pursuits. The implication was clear. We should be giving more time and more money to the organization, trusting that Jehovah would somehow provide for our material needs. I reduced my hours at the hospital from 40 hours a week to 32, taking a significant pay cut that I offset by picking up occasional night shifts. My donations increased to $400 a month, plus whatever extra I could scrape together for the various special funds that seemed to pop up regularly. There was always something. The Kingdom Hall Building Fund, the Worldwide Work, the Disaster Relief Fund, the Circuit Assembly deficit that somehow appeared at every single assembly, no matter how much money had been collected. Nathan started to resent the organization around this time. He was old enough to understand that we were poorer than most of his classmates, that our apartment was small and shabby, that he couldn't participate in after-school activities because I needed him to come with me in the preaching work or I had meetings to attend. He started questioning why Jehovah needed so much money if he was the creator of the universe. I shut down those questions immediately, terrified that my son was developing a critical spirit that could lead him away from the truth. The conventions were particularly expensive. 3-day district conventions required taking time off work, paying for accommodations if they were held in another city, buying meals for both of us, and of course, donating to cover the convention expenses. The organization would announce the per capita cost of the convention, usually something like $12 per publisher per day, and strongly encourage everyone to donate at least that amount. For a 3-day convention, that was $72, not counting the voluntary donations for the worldwide work that were heavily emphasized during the program. I remember one year being short on rent money because I'd donated too much at the district convention. I was terrified of being evicted, but I couldn't bring myself to ask for the money back because that would have been a sign of weak faith. Instead, I picked up an extra nursing shift, worked 16 hours straight, and came home so exhausted I could barely walk up the stairs to our apartment. Nathan, who was 12 by then, looked at me with something I'd never seen in his eyes before, anger mixed with concern. He asked me why I was killing myself for an organization that didn't seem to care whether we had food on the table. I reported his comments to the elders, believing I was doing the right thing by seeking spiritual guidance for my son's rebellious attitude. They recommended that I study more with him, that I increase family worship time, that I make sure he was associating only with good witness youth and not with worldly children at school who might be influencing him negatively. They never suggested that maybe, just maybe, a 12-year-old child had a valid point about his mother sacrificing their well-being for an organization's financial demands. The pressure to give wasn't just coming from the stage anymore. It was embedded in the culture of the congregation. Sisters would casually mention how much they'd donated to this or that fund, and there was an unspoken competition about who was more generous, who loved Jehovah more, who was willing to sacrifice more for kingdom interests. If you didn't participate in this culture of giving, you were viewed as materialistic, as someone who loved money more than spiritual things, as weak in faith. I started donating money I didn't have, using credit cards to make up the difference between what I earned and what I felt obligated to give. This is something I'm deeply ashamed of now, but at the time it seemed like the right thing to do. The end was so close, the organization kept telling us. Armageddon could come any day now. What did it matter if I had credit card debt when the entire system of things was about to be destroyed? Better to give everything to Jehovah's organization now, and trust that I'd be taken care of in the new world. By the end of my 10th year in the organization, I donated approximately $43,000. I know this because I kept meticulous records, partly because I wanted to track my faithfulness and partly because I was claiming tax deductions for my charitable giving. The tax returns from those years are painful to look at now. I was making decent money as a nurse, but after tithing, donating 10 to 15% of my income to the organization, I was barely scraping by. Nathan and I were living paycheck to paycheck while I poured thousands of dollars into contribution boxes. Everything changed when my mother died. I was 39 years old, I'd been in the organization for 10 years, and my mother, who had never approved of my involvement with the witnesses, passed away from cancer after a brutal 6-month battle. She left me her house, a modest 3-bedroom property in a decent neighborhood, valued at around 250,000 Australian dollars. It was the largest amount of money I'd ever had access to in my entire life, and I knew exactly what the organization expected me to do with it. The elders approached me within a week of the funeral. They expressed their condolences, of course, but then they gently mentioned what a wonderful opportunity this was to show my devotion to Jehovah by making a significant donation to the worldwide work. They told me stories of other faithful servants who had inherited money or property and had donated the entire amount to the organization, receiving tremendous blessings as a result. They never directly told me to donate my inheritance, but the implication was crystal clear. I wrestled with the decision for weeks. Nathan was 15 years old and would be thinking about college in a few years. The house could have secured his education, could have given him opportunities I'd never had. But the meetings, the publications, the constant messaging from the organization had done their work well. I believed that the end was coming soon, that college was a waste of time, that Nathan would be better off if I used the money to support kingdom interests, and trusted that Jehovah would provide for his future. I sold my mother's house and donated $100,000 to the organization. $100,000. In one donation. The check was made out to Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Australia, and I handed it to the presiding overseer with tears streaming down my face, believing I was making the greatest sacrifice of faith I'd ever made. The congregation applauded when the announcement was made, though they didn't specify the amount. The circuit overseer mentioned my donation in his talk, calling it an example of extraordinary faith and generosity. Nathan didn't speak to me for 3 days when I told him what I'd done. He was 15 years old and old enough to understand that I'd just given away his grandmother's house, his potential future, his chance at a normal life. He told me I was in a cult. He told me I'd been brainwashed. He told me that Grandma would be devastated to know I'd given her house to the organization she'd begged me to leave. I slapped him across the face, something I'd never done before, and immediately reported his apostate talk to the elders. They marked him as bad association. At 15 years old, my son was marked as someone the congregation should limit contact with because he'd dared to criticize my decision to donate his inheritance. The young people he'd grown up with, the only friends he had since I didn't allow him to associate with worldly children, started avoiding him. He became isolated, depressed, and angry. I told myself this was Satan testing us, that Nathan needed to be humble and accept correction, that if he developed the right heart attitude, Jehovah would bless him. The remaining $150,000 from the house sale went into savings, but not for long. Over the next 5 years, I donated another $80,000 of that money in increments. Whenever there was a special appeal for Kingdom Hall construction, I'd write a check for $5,000 or $10,000. When the organization announced the new World Headquarters project at Warwick, I donated $15,000 specifically for that purpose, believing I was contributing to something that would stand as a testament to Jehovah's sovereignty for generations. The praise from the congregation was intoxicating. I was invited to give experiences at circuit assemblies about the blessings I'd received from generous giving. Never mind that the blessings were largely emotional and social, the approval of the elders and the congregation, rather than anything tangible. Never mind that I was still living in a cramped apartment, still struggling to make ends meet, still driving a car that was falling apart. The spiritual blessings were what mattered, they told me, and I believed them. Nathan left home the day he turned 18. He just packed a bag, walked out the door, and I didn't hear from him for 2 years. The elders told me this was a consequence of my not training him properly in the truth, of being too lenient with him, of not being strong enough in disciplining his rebellious spirit. They never once acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, my financial priorities had contributed to his decision to leave. They never suggested that giving away his inheritance might have damaged our relationship beyond repair. During those 2 years of silence, I doubled down on my involvement in the organization. I went back to regular pioneering, attending every meeting, volunteering for every assignment, and yes, continuing to donate significant amounts of money. The pain of losing my son was unbearable, and the only way I knew how to cope was to immerse myself deeper into the organization that had caused the rift between us in the first place. It's a common pattern among witnesses who lose family members. Instead of questioning whether the organization might be part of the problem, they assume they haven't been faithful enough and commit even harder. The irony is that during this period, when I was most vulnerable and most generous with my donations, I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. The Kingdom Hall had been paid off for years, yet we were still being asked to donate to the Kingdom Hall Fund every month. The organization had announced a massive construction program, building hundreds of new Kingdom Halls worldwide, yet congregations were being asked to send their excess funds to the branch office with no clear accounting of how that money was being used. I was 48 years old when I started asking questions I wasn't supposed to ask. It began innocently enough. The congregation had been sending several $1,000s a month to the branch office for years. Our monthly expenses were relatively small, and we had no outstanding loans or renovation projects. Yet every month, the account servant would announce that we had a surplus, and that surplus would be sent to the branch. I wondered out loud during a book study why we couldn't keep some of that money in reserve for emergency repairs or future needs. The elder conducting the study looked uncomfortable. He explained that it was the organization's policy for congregations to maintain only a small reserve, usually around 3 months of operating expenses, and to send everything else to the branch office. When I asked what the branch office did with all that money, he told me it supported the worldwide work and that we should trust the faithful and discreet slave to manage it appropriately. When I pressed further, asking if there were financial reports available that showed how the donated funds were being used, his discomfort turned to irritation. After the study, he pulled me aside and counseled me about having a questioning spirit. He reminded me that the organization was Jehovah's channel of communication, and that questioning how the money was managed was essentially questioning Jehovah himself. He suggested that perhaps I needed to work on my humility and my trust in the faithful and discreet slave. I left that conversation feeling ashamed and guilty, but the questions didn't go away. They just went underground, festering in my mind like an infection. Around this same time, I reconnected with Nathan. He was 20 years old, working as an apprentice electrician, and living with roommates in a different part of Perth. Our reunion was tense and painful. He'd built a life completely separate from the organization, and he was angry with me, though he tried to hide it. During one of our early conversations, he asked me how much money I'd donated to the witnesses over the years. I'd never calculated the total before, and when I sat down and went through my records, I was shocked to realize it was already over $200,000. Nathan was furious. He did the math immediately, calculating what that money could have done for our lives. Could have bought us a house. It could have paid for his education without debt. It could have given us financial security and opportunities I denied us both in service to an organization that had given us nothing tangible in return. He asked me what I had to show for all that money, and I couldn't give him a good answer. I talked about spiritual blessings and treasures in heaven, and he looked at me with such sadness that it broke something inside me. That conversation planted a seed of doubt that I tried desperately to ignore. I increased my meeting attendance, my preaching hours, my donations, anything to drown out the nagging voice that was asking if Nathan might be right. But the more I tried to suppress the questions, the more they multiplied. I started noticing things I'd overlooked for years. The way the organization constantly talked about being poor and needing donations while simultaneously building a massive new headquarters. The way they'd shut down the Bethel homes in various countries and sold the properties for millions of dollars. The way they'd settled multiple child abuse lawsuits out of court for undisclosed amounts. I discovered the internet, something I'd mostly avoided because the organization discouraged witnesses from researching information about the organization outside of official publications. What I found was devastating. There were websites documenting the organization's extensive real estate holdings, worth billions of dollars. There were reports of kingdom halls being built by volunteer labor and then sold by the organization, with the profits going to headquarters rather than to the local congregations who had paid for the materials. There were financial documents showing that the organization had assets worth multiple billions of dollars while simultaneously telling publishers that they were struggling financially. The child abuse cases were what really broke me. I'd heard whispers about these cases over the years, but the elders had always dismissed them as apostate lies or persecution from Satan's world. Now I was reading court documents, watching news reports, seeing actual evidence of the organization's policy of requiring 2 witnesses to an accusation of child abuse, a policy that had allowed predators to continue abusing children because they rarely abuse in front of witnesses. I read about the Australian Royal Commission findings, about the 1,006 alleged perpetrators in Australia alone, about the organization's failure to report these cases to police. My donations slowed to a trickle. I couldn't bring myself to stop completely because I was terrified that if I did, it would mean I'd wasted 30 years of my life and over $200,000 on a lie. But I couldn't keep giving with the same enthusiasm I'd had before. The elders noticed immediately. They scheduled shepherding calls to find out what was wrong with me, whether I was struggling with depression or facing some spiritual weakness. I couldn't tell them the truth because the truth was that I was doubting everything they'd taught me for 3 decades. I started looking at the people around me in the congregation with new eyes. I saw the single mothers struggling to make rent while donating money they didn't have. I saw the elderly brothers and sisters living in poverty while the organization they'd given their lives to sat on billions in assets. I saw the young people Nathan's age and younger, sacrificing their education and career opportunities because the organization told them the end was coming soon, just like they told me 30 years ago, and 40 years before that, and 70 years before that. The breaking point came during a local needs talk about donations. The elder giving the talk mentioned that some in the congregation weren't contributing adequately to the worldwide work, and that this showed a lack of appreciation for all that Jehovah had given us. He specifically mentioned that even those on limited incomes should be finding ways to donate regularly, citing the widow's mite story from the Bible. I looked around the hall and saw people nodding in agreement, including a sister I knew was on disability benefits and could barely afford food. That night, I went home and calculated my total donations for the first time in years. The number that came up was staggering. By that point, I donated $267,000 over 32 years. $267,000 to an organization that was now pressuring people in poverty to donate money they didn't have. I sat at my kitchen table and cried until I thought I might throw up. Everything I'd believed, everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd destroyed my relationship with my son for, was built on manipulation and lies. The next 2 years were the most difficult of my life. I couldn't just walk away from the organization because that would mean losing everyone I'd known for 32 years. The witnesses practice strict shunning of anyone who leaves or is disfellowshipped, cutting them off completely from friends and family who remain in the organization. I had no friends outside the congregation. My entire social support system, everyone I'd spent decades building relationships with, would disappear the moment I was labeled an apostate. I started what they call a careful fade, slowly reducing my involvement while trying not to trigger the elders' attention. I stopped commenting at meetings. I reduced my field service time. I made excuses for why I couldn't attend assemblies. I stopped donating completely, which was noticed immediately but which I justified by saying I was having financial difficulties. The elders scheduled multiple shepherding calls, each one more intense than the last, trying to figure out what was wrong and how to get me back on track. During this time I kept donating money, not to the organization but to make amends. I gave $20,000 to Nathan to help him start his own electrical business. I donated money to legitimate charities, organizations that actually helped people and provided transparent financial records showing exactly where donations went. Each donation I made to a real charity felt like a small act of redemption, trying to balance out some of the harm I'd caused by supporting the organization for so long. The end came when I was 51 years old. A sister in the congregation had seen me having coffee with Nathan, who the congregation considered to be disfellowshipped even though he'd never been baptized and had simply walked away. Having association with someone the congregation viewed as an outcast was enough to trigger a judicial committee. The elders invited me to meet with them, and I knew what was coming. I could either lie, deny my doubts, and pretend everything was fine, or I could tell the truth and face the consequences. I told them the truth. I told them about my research into the organization's finances, about the child abuse cases, about my doubts regarding whether the organization was actually God's channel of communication. I told them I couldn't continue to be part of something that I believed was fundamentally dishonest and harmful. They listened with hardened faces, and then they told me I was exhibiting signs of apostasy and that if I didn't repent and stop spreading doubts, they would have no choice but to disfellowship me. I didn't repent. I was disfellowshipped 3 weeks later. The announcement was made from the stage during the midweek meeting. Beverly Walsh is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Just like that, 32 years of friendship, service, and community were erased. People I'd known for decades, sisters I'd cried with and laughed with and pioneered with, walked past me in the parking lot after the meeting as if I didn't exist. June, the woman who'd brought me into the organization all those years ago, looked through me like I was invisible. The shunning was brutal but also liberating. For the first time in over 3 decades, I didn't have to pretend anymore. I didn't have to keep up appearances, didn't have to force myself to believe things that didn't make sense, didn't have to donate money I couldn't afford to an organization that didn't care whether I lived or died. I started therapy, working through the trauma of losing everyone I'd known and coming to terms with the fact that I'd been manipulated for most of my adult life. I also started the painful process of calculating exactly how much I'd given the organization over the years. The final number, when I included everything, monthly donations, convention contributions, Kingdom Hall funds, special donations for world headquarters, the $100,000 from my mother's estate, and all the small amounts that added up over time, came to $287,000. $287,000 that I would never get back, that was now sitting in the organization's investment portfolios or had been used to pay lawyers defending child abuse cases or had funded the luxurious lifestyle of the governing body members. Nathan and I rebuilt our relationship slowly. He was patient with me as I worked through my anger and grief. He never said I told you so, even though he had every right to. He helped me understand that I'd been the victim of a high-control group, that the manipulation I'd experienced was sophisticated and deliberate, that I shouldn't be ashamed of being deceived by people who were experts at deception. His forgiveness meant more to me than anything the organization had ever given me. I'm 63 years old now, 12 years out of the organization. I work part-time as a nurse consultant, I live modestly in a small apartment, and I drive a car that's seen better days. I should be comfortable in retirement. I should have savings and investments and the security of knowing I can afford whatever health crises might come my way in my remaining years. Instead, I live paycheck to paycheck because I gave almost $300,000 to an organization that threw me away the moment I started asking questions. Every time I drive past a Kingdom Hall, I feel that twist in my stomach. I see the people going in for meetings, carrying their books and Bibles, believing they're serving God, not realizing they're serving a publishing corporation that masquerades as a religion. I see the contribution boxes and I think about all the money flowing into them from people who can't afford it, people who are sacrificing their financial security because they've been convinced that generous giving is a measure of their faith and their chances of surviving Armageddon. Some people ask me if I regret my time in the organization. That's a complicated question. I regret the money, absolutely. I regret the years I lost with Nathan, the damage I did to our relationship that we're still working to repair. I regret the opportunities one missed, the education I didn't pursue, the life I could have lived if I hadn't been trapped in a high-control group. But I don't regret leaving, and I don't regret speaking out now, even though it means admitting that I was deceived for over 3 decades. If you're currently one of Jehovah's Witnesses and you're watching this video, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I'm an apostate, that I'm mentally diseased, that Satan is using me to spread lies about God's organization. I know, because that's exactly what I would have thought 12 years ago. But I'm asking you to do something that the organization discourages. Think critically. Look at the financial structure of the organization. Ask yourself why a group that claims to be poor needs constant donations while sitting on billions in assets. Ask yourself why they won't provide transparent financial records. Ask yourself why they settle child abuse cases out of court instead of allowing the legal process to bring the truth to light. I'm not trying to destroy your faith in God or the Bible. I'm trying to wake you up to the reality that you're being manipulated by an organization that prioritizes its own survival and growth over the well-being of its members. The $287,000 I donated could have changed my life and my son's life. It could have provided security, opportunity, and freedom. Instead, it's sitting in the organization's bank accounts while I struggle to make ends meet in my 60s. Don't let this be your story. Don't wait until you've given away your inheritance, your retirement, your children's future before you start asking the questions I should have asked 30 years ago. The organization will tell you that I'm bitter and angry, and maybe I am. I think I have a right to be both. But more than anything, I'm free. Free to think, free to question, free to live my life without the constant pressure to do more, give more, sacrifice more for an organization that would discard me without a second thought. That freedom is worth more than the $287,000 I lost, and I hope that by sharing my story, I can help someone else find that freedom before they've sacrificed as much as I did. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And please, if you're in the organization and you have doubts, trust those doubts. They're your mind trying to protect you from further harm. Don't silence them the way I did for so many years. Your life, your money, and your future are worth more than any organization's demands for loyalty and financial support.